Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think it's time to start. 1 o'clock has come. Welcome to this afternoon's Faraday Research Seminar. My name is Keith Fox. I'm Director of the Faraday Institute, and it's a privilege to be able to welcome you and to welcome our speaker this afternoon. So, as I say, it's a privilege this afternoon to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jonathan Jong. Jonathan is assistant professor at Coventry University in the Centre for Trust, Peace and Social Relations. He's also attached to the Institute for Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology, as well as the Ian Ramsay Centre for Science and Religion, both of which are based in Oxford University. Jonathan's background is in psychology, where he obtained his first degree and PhD from the University of Otago in New Zealand. His research concerns the psychology of religion and the philosophical issues associated with the scientific study of religion. In addition to all that, as a busy man, he's also an associate priest in one of the parishes in Oxford. So Jonathan, it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome you to give a talk today, and you're going to be talking to us on the experimental psychology of religion. Jonathan, over to you. Thank you.
Yes, that's right. Thank you for having me. Thank you for everyone being here. It's a great privilege to speak to the Faraday Institute, in part because the Institute played a really important role in my own faith development when I was a graduate student so many years ago. Right, let's begin. The following thoughts are the outworking of a crisis of faith of sorts, not in God or the church, but in experimental psychology itself as a scientific enterprise. Nor was this a personal crisis on my own part, but one shared by many of us in this particular guild, given recent events. The first rumblings of a problem came not from psychology, but from the biomedical sciences. In the early 2000s, people began noticing failures to replicate the results of clinical trials and correlational studies in genetic and neuroimaging research. And then in 2010, a preprint of an article began circulating in which a prominent social psychologist, Daryl Bem, reported experimental evidence for extrasensory perception. When it was published in a top-tier journal, people went ballistic. The problem wasn't outright fraud, though there are certainly cases of fabricated data in science. It was something more insidious, which was that real data was being handled in subtly questionable ways that led to the inflation of false positive results. Rather than trying to explain the statistical issues, I'll use a simple example that illustrates the gist of the problems. Consider an unbiased coin. We know that when flipped, such a coin has a 50% chance of landing heads up and a 50% chance of landing tails up. But this is not to say that an actual series of coin flips will alternate between heads and tails perfectly. Sometimes we will have a row of heads, sometimes we will have a row of tails. But with any sufficiently long series of coin flips, we will get approximately equal numbers of heads and tails. But say we suspect that the coin is biased toward heads. So we run the experiment, and our first 4 flips show no bias. So we keep going until we do get a row of heads, at which point we stop the experiment and conclude that the coin is slightly biased. Or say we flip the coin 4 times and find no bias, and so we decide that maybe we're not flipping it right and need a rest. After a rest, we try another 4 times and still find no bias. And this time we decide that the wind is messing up the results. So we try another 4 flips indoors, and lo, this time we find that 3 of the 4 coin flips lands heads up. So we chalk up the first 2 attempts as poorly executed experiments and base our conclusions solely on the third, which we assume to be methodologically superior. Or say we actually flip the coin 12 times and find no bias, but then we think that the first time shouldn't count because that was a practice trial. And also the doorbell rang right before the 5th one, so maybe we should exclude that as well. Well, now with the remaining 10 trials, we find that the coin is slightly biased after all. In all 3 cases, an unbiased coin nevertheless produces biased conclusions. Bem still disputes this, but most psychologists concluded that this was the sort of thing that was going on in his data. And then Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia had the self-critical insight to wonder if this was a bigger problem rather than just an isolated incident. By mid-2012, he had persuaded dozens of experimental psychologists to try to replicate 100 experiments published in top-tier journals. Their brief was to follow the original protocols as closely as possible with as large sample sizes as possible. The results published in 2015 were dismaying. Only about a third of these attempts succeeded. People still argue about what replication failures mean. But for many experimental psychologists at the beginnings of their careers, I started my first job in 2012 and my first permanent position in 2015, it triggered the crisis of faith with which I started this talk. My response to all of this was to revisit the work most relevant to my own research, which was and is about social and psychological influences on religious belief. The vast majority of psychological research on religion is correlational. There are hundreds and hundreds of papers looking for statistical relationships between personality traits and religiosity, IQ and religiosity, physical and mental health and religiosity, charitable giving and religiosity, brain activity and religiosity, and so forth. These are susceptible to the questionable research practices that produce unreliable results too, but are not my primary concern. I wanted to know what experimental methods could tell us, in part because the experiment is still our primary way of testing causal hypotheses, which are the hypotheses I care most about. Now, it turns out that there aren't very many psychology experiments on religion. I recently came across an article written by the legendary social psychologist C.D. Batson in 1977, in which he could only think of two. There are a few more now, but there are still no more than a dozen or so published experiments that measure religiosity or close enough as a dependent variable. Plenty of studies look at what difference being religious makes in various other contexts, but very few examine changes in religious belief itself. The reason for this might be quite obvious. Religious beliefs are hard to shift, especially in adulthood. We know this is true in real life. People do not tend to change their religious views, and when they do, it is typically a gradual and complex process. The idea that we might be able to shift people's religious beliefs in any direction in a lab is faintly absurd. But then again, subtle fluctuations in our religious beliefs are much more common. We have all experienced this too. Some days we doubt more than other days. Some days, even ardent atheists feel the fleeting need to pray. And some Bible passages and hymns speak to us more than others. Some doctrines are easier to understand than others. And at least in principle, these kinds of differences and changes can be studied experimentally in the lab. So I found as many examples of experiments as I could that fit my criteria, and where I could, spoke to the original authors of the papers and tried to make some sense of whether it is a waste of time to run experiments on religion. All this resulted in a book that I'm still writing, still struggling with the conclusion, and this talk gives me an opportunity to think about what sorts of conclusions I can draw. So here, in brief, is what I think I've learned from all this. The first lesson I drew was that between subjects designs are not very promising. The classic experiment, and not just in psychology, is the between subjects experiment. When I was in school, the standard example involved two pots containing identical amounts of the same soil and water, into which were planted identical amounts of the same seed. One was exposed to sunlight while the other was kept in the dark and low. The former sprouted and grew, whereas the other remained dormant. This is how many of the ongoing randomized control trials for COVID-19 vaccines are structured as well. Some participants are given the vaccine, whereas others are given a placebo. Both are exposed to the virus and infection rates are compared. And this is also how the infamous Great Prayer experiment worked, in which about 1,800 patients about to undergo heart surgery were randomly assigned to be prayed for or not to see if intercessory prayer made any difference to the health outcomes. One of the best known and earliest psychology experiments on religion had a between subjects design. 10 seminarians at Boston University were given a psilocybin pill, and another 10 were given a vitamin B placebo. They all then attended a Good Friday service and were interviewed afterwards. The seminarians who were given the psychedelic described all kinds of interesting experiences and feelings of oneness with the world and the sacredness of things. But what people generally don't say when they describe this experiment is that the drug made no difference to feelings of the love of or closeness with God. Now, it is certainly unfair to describe this classic study as unpromising, but if by religion one primarily means the beliefs, behaviors, and experiences related to gods, then the Marsh Chapel experiment really did not show very much. It is now impossible to run such studies in most places, so psychologists have not been able to replicate the original experiment. However, a follow-up study on the surviving participants found very similar results over 25 years later. More recent experiments which invariably rely on subtler manipulations have been easier to replicate, and these have not fared very well. In 2012, the journal Science published a paper reporting a series of experiments in which participants were allegedly put in an analytic frame of mind or an intuitive frame of mind. The example that made the news was the one that used images of Rodin's sculpture, The Thinker, and the ancient Greek sculpture, The Discus Thrower, respectively. Mind you, the experimenters did run manipulation checks and found that exposure to these images did in fact lead participants to engage in more analytic and intuitive thinking, respectively, based on performance in a reasoning task. They also found that participants exposed to the analytic thinking primes reported lower levels of religious belief than those exposed to the intuitive thinking primes, and concluded, therefore, that analytic thinking causes religious disbelief. And then in 2017 and 18, two different teams tried to replicate the main findings of the paper and failed. To their credit, the authors of the original paper were very cooperative and were persuaded that their finding was indeed a false positive. However, the paper remains available in Science today and continues to rack up citations. Closer to home for me is the handful of studies that involve reminders of one's mortality as the experimental manipulation, while control participants are either made to contemplate something less confronting or something anxiety-inducing that is unrelated to death. Results have varied across studies, none of which are exact replications of one another. But if one were compelled to draw some conclusion, it would be that religious people report stronger belief when reminded of their mortality, whereas non-religious people seem unaffected. In other words, there is no general effect. Indeed, even the effect on religious people does not show up in every study, and so the effect is unreliable. And finally, there are the experiments that have not yet been replicated, but which upon closer inspection, we have good reasons to doubt. My favorite example is by a team from the University of Chicago and Harvard. In this study, people were given a personality quiz, a bit more realistic than the stuff you do on BuzzFeed and related websites. At the end of the quiz, participants are told that their test results are actually pretty good indicators of certain future outcomes. Half the participants are then told that based on their quiz results, they're pretty likely to live ordinary, happy lives surrounded by friends and family. The other half are told that they'll probably end up alone forever. When asked later whether they believed in God, the devil, ghosts, and other such things, the participants who were made to feel lonely reported higher levels of belief than those who were not made to feel lonely. I like this experiment mostly because I wish I'd thought of it first. There is mild cruelty notwithstanding, nothing wrong with this experiment methodologically. On the face of it, it all seems quite plausible. However, the original study was underpowered statistically. Its sample was smaller than it should have been given the small size of the effect that they found. It is possible that an attempt to replicate this finding with a 50% larger sample, which is the minimum required, would succeed, but it is difficult to say. It is also not easy to say why between subjects experiments are so unpromising, but if I were to guess, I would say that it is because they require more experimental control than psychologists generally have available to us. When particle physicists run experiments, they do so in complicated machines that produce the particles that they're interested in and allow the experimenter to extract everything else that might interfere with the observation. When microbiologists run experiments, they work with clones in sterile petri dishes, which reduces genetic variation and extraneous biological interference. Such pristine conditions are just not available to scientists who work with human beings. Instead, we rely on large and random or matched samples and hope, not without reason, that individual differences come out in the wash. This is true for experiments on vaccines as it is for experiments on religion. The difference, however, is that a lot of biological research is stepwise. Long before we get to human trials, we will have learned a great deal from the study of the virus itself, tests on animal models, and computer simulations. So we will have a decent guess about what sampling characteristics and statistical controls are desirable. This kind of scaffolding is rarely possible in psychology, and so the challenge is harder. The second lesson I think I can draw is related to the first, which is that within subjects designs are much more promising. The classic example of a within subjects experiment is a bit like an infomercial for exercise equipment, in that it involves before and after measurements, in between which is the experimental manipulation itself. Psychologists tend not to like this particular setup because we worry that participants don't respond well to being asked the same questions twice. or being given the same tasks twice. There are various ways around this, such as taking the baseline measure many days or even weeks before the experiment itself, or asking the same questions in very different ways. But generally speaking, we avoid this altogether. However, there is another kind of within subjects design which is more common and which is a bit like shopping for a wedding cake, in that it involves exposing each participant to a bunch of different things that vary along a finite number of dimensions. Now that I think about it, maybe only experimental psychologists shop for wedding cakes in this way. The psychological studies on religion that employ within subjects designs tend to be about what we might call religious intuitions, that is, predispositions to think a particular way about gods, souls, and the like. Let's start with souls. Religious traditions differ in their doctrines of the soul, from Buddhist conceptions that explicitly deny that there is such a thing but allow for rebirth, to Christian conceptions that affirm the existence in the soul that is a metaphysical part of the person, to more popular depictions that identify the soul as the person herself, who just inhabits a body as a shell. But regardless of detail, all over the world, there is some idea of a part of us that is distinct from the physical and mortal aspects in such a way that permits an afterlife. Recently, psychologists have been interested in finding out how deep this intuition goes. One of my favorite experiments of all time is one in which the developmental psychologist Bruce Hood, now at Bristol University, tricked 5-year-olds into thinking that he could clone hamsters. The children were first introduced to a hamster, which they were told was special, as its heart was blue in color. And by the way, it earlier accidentally swallowed a marble, which is now in its belly, and in the course of eating the marble, had chipped a tooth deep in its mouth, hidden from view. So what we have is 3 physical traits, all invisible to the children. And then the children were allowed to play with the hamster and asked to whisper their names to it and to show it a drawing they had made and to tickle it. And now we have 3 memories of a name, a drawing, and a tickling. Next, the researchers showed the children a duplicating machine. They demonstrated that it could copy any object inserted into it and checked to make sure the children understood that that was what was happening. Then they popped the hamster in and out came 2 hamsters. The children were then asked about this new hamster. Which of the traits of the original were copied over? And it turns out that children are twice as likely to say that the physical traits copied than they were to say that the memories did. At age 5, likely before they were taught about mind-body dualism in any systematic fashion, children seem to draw a strong distinction between physical and psychological traits. Bruce Hood's team also repeated the study using a camera instead of a hamster, and there the children did not distinguish between physical traits, such as a broken latch or a blue battery, and the memories of a camera, such as the photographs and audio or video recordings in the camera. Both copied over, said the children. Furthermore, in another version of the experiment, the distinction drawn between physical and psychological traits was even more pronounced when the hamster was given a name. Bruce Hood's conclusion from all of this is that we have a natural tendency toward dualism when it comes to animals, treating psychological traits as different and special from physical traits. And this tendency, increases when we're encouraged to think of animals in personal terms. We'll get to whether this study replicates in a second. One more study first on the same theme, also on children, this time slightly younger on average, but with a wider distribution. Psychologist Jesse Bering showed children a puppet show in which a mouse gets eaten by an alligator. He then asked the children questions about the mouse, now that it was dead. Does it still require food? Does it still feel hunger? Can it still see or smell or hear? Is it sad to be dead? Does it miss its mother? Does it know it's dead? And what he found was that children were more likely to say that the mouse could no longer experience hunger or vision or smell than they were to say that it could no longer experience psychological states that were more closely associated with personhood, I guess, emotions, desire, and knowledge. He ran an analogous study with adults too and found more or less the same distinction between perceptual states and richer, more personal ones. Even among people who consistently denied all psychological states to the dead, they took longer to do so for these more human states like love and knowledge. Jesse also likes to tell the story of the man who came into the experiment and insisted that he didn't believe in any sort of afterlife. And now the deceased character in the story knew that he was right, which of course is a sort of contradiction. Like Bruce's study, Jesse's also suggests an intuitive distinction made by children and adults alike between different kinds of mental states, some of which are treated as special and sufficiently distinct from the body that they survive the body's death. And both of these studies have been independently replicated, even cross-culturally. I myself have replicated some of them myself, with some modifications to make online data collection possible. Bruce and Jesse collected data in the UK and US respectively, and I found very similar results in some of the least religious countries in the world, like the Netherlands, the Czech Republic, and Japan. We are now already touching upon the third lesson, which I'm drawing, which is that cross-cultural replication is crucial in the study of religion. Until remarkably recently, the psychology of religion would have better been described as the psychology of American Protestants. In some other fields of psychology, one might be satisfied with findings that replicate within the same cultural milieu, but those of us interested in religion tend to want to be able to say something fundamental about human nature, and this necessitates that we look beyond our backyards. Deborah Kellerman does not think of herself as studying religion, nor are her experiments straightforwardly about religious beliefs per se, but they have featured in a lot of theoretical work in the psychology and cognitive science of religion. Her main and abiding interest is in how children make sense of what exists in the world and why. One of the basic distinctions that adults know how to make is the distinction between artifacts, that is, things designed for a purpose, and non-artifacts, including the results of accidental human action, like shards of glass on the ground from a dropped bottle, and natural mechanical forces like stalactites and stalagmites. Deborah Kellerman's idea is that we have a natural bias toward thinking of things as artifacts, which comes from a more fundamental tendency to interpret the world in intentional terms. This tendency may have evolved to help us better negotiate our social lives, but spills over into how we navigate our physical world as well. Just in case the relevance of religion is not obvious, Kellerman's work can be thought of as being about the psychological basis of believing in things like intelligent design theory, the teleological argument for the existence of God, and also the vaguer sense that everything happens for a reason. She has run many studies all over on this theme in different ways and in different countries. Her research program is a marvel of single-minded focus. The one that's easiest to explain is on 7-year-olds who had to choose between competing explanations for why something is the way it is. For example, when shown a picture of a rock and asked why it is pointy, would the children prefer to say that it is pointy because minerals accumulated on it over time, or it's pointy so that animals can scratch their backs on it? Adults clearly prefer the first option, but it turns out that children prefer the second. And next, as a test of how strong this intuition was, she reran the study, but first described how scientists explained why there are clouds. Clouds are not for making rain to water the crops, but rather they are the result of processes like evaporation and such like. The children were then encouraged to think like scientists do during the task, but they unrepentantly proceeded to think of natural objects as artifacts. This is meant to be a section about cross-cultural replication, so I should probably get started on that. But first, I'd like to say that people run cross-cultural studies for all kinds of reasons, some of which are just for the sake of running cross-cultural studies. Every so often, one sees research reports about studies conducted in 10 or 20 or even 60 countries, but it is not at all obvious what the rationale is behind collecting data in those particular countries. I am guilty of this kind of thing myself. Kellerman's approach is much more systematic and principled. After running her original studies in the US, she brought it here to the UK, which is a significantly less religious country, and she found similar results, but with some evidence that the bias is somewhat weaker here. Then she brought the study to China, which is a very irreligious country, without being anti-religious either. After decades of communist rule, most people are religiously apathetic. In any case, religious ideas are not a part of the fabric of life there, as they are even in secular Western European nations that score equally on not being religious. And true enough, she found a diminished effect there. But children still showed some bias toward interpreting natural objects as artifacts. And then she brought the experiment back to the United States, this time recruiting adults, scientists from elite universities, who were trained to think mechanistically about causes in the world. The study had to be modified for them, otherwise it would be too easy to reject the artifactual explanations. So Kellerman presented these scientists with causal statements and had them classify them as true or false. Naturally, some of these statements were true and others were false, but crucially, some of them were false because they implied purpose or intention, like the statement, the sun radiates heat because warmth nurtures life, and germs mutate in order to become drug resistant. Kellerman wanted to know what scientists made of statements like these. Unsurprisingly, she found that they were very good at recognizing these sorts of false statements, only committing errors about 15% of the time, which is considerably better than non-scientists who got things wrong well more than half the time. But she had an additional experimental manipulation. In one phase of the study, the participants were given a very short time, a time limit for each response, so they had to perform very quickly and under time pressure. This added cognitive load did not seem to affect any other judgments except the ones about these kinds of statements, where their error rates actually doubled. I love this work, not because of what it found, but because of the arc that it has taken. Kellerman has tried to break her finding over and over again by bringing the experiment to places where it is less and less likely to work. And she does find that the cultural context makes a difference, but there always remains some evidence of this intuition that things are the way they are for some purpose. Now, I'm aware that I've said very little of theological significance. This is, in a way, deliberate. I've spent most of my career trying to persuade people that science is usually of very little theological significance, and that most of what happens under the description of science and religion or science engaged theology is really an encounter between theology and metaphysical commitments that are formally independent from empirical findings on one hand and scientific theories on the other. Theologians wrestle with ideas like determinism and indeterminism rather than linear partial differential equations, with ideas like biological reductionism rather than the role of inositol phosphatase in synaptic polarization. Hand even the most science engaged theologian the most recent copy of Science or Nature, and they would have little of substance to say about its contents. And why should they have anything to say about taste receptors on cephalopod arms or transient radio pulsations from magnetars and the increase of pterosaur flight efficiency in the Triassic? These are all in the current issue of Nature. But let me try to play ball by very briefly considering the history of theorizing about religion. People have been speculating about the historical and psychological origins of religion for a very long time. And for pretty much all of this time, theories of religion have been theories of other people's religion. Perhaps the earliest examples of this were the hypotheses of ancient Greek and Roman philosophers like Xenophanes and Euhemerus and Lucretius, who wrote about why the folk believed in such fickle and flawed gods. Christians were eager to jump in as well. From Justin Martyr onward, the prevailing theory of pagan religion involved demons whispering lies to poets and posing as gods to be worshipped. This theory of religion, if we can call it that, persisted for an embarrassingly long time. It was still commonplace in the 18th century as Christian missionaries encountered the diverse religious beliefs and practices in the lands they were colonizing. Even now, some Christians hold on to this diabolical view of other people's religious beliefs. It is easy to see why theories of religion are always theories of other people's religion. One's own beliefs are obviously the products of pure reason or divine revelation, and as such need no further explanation. Other people's beliefs, on the other hand, and by contrast, are obviously foolish or even wicked. It is puzzling how they could have gotten things so wrong. The great innovation of the 18th century, chiefly by the pen of David Hume, was to theorize about religion in general, with no exceptions, by seeing all religion as other people's religion. This is the benefit of being an atheist, if you like. But it doesn't have to be this way. There is no reason for Christians or adherents of any other faith to view explanations of religion as attacks. Rather, they are opportunities to understand ourselves and one another. There is humility and empathy and generosity to be gained by understanding that our religious beliefs, yours, mine, the Dalai Lama's, Richard Dawkins's, are shaped by all kinds of things, obvious and subtle, rational and irrational, innocuous, and perhaps sometimes even troubling. We are, in this sense, in the same epistemological boat, prone to the same kinds of errors, and the way out of them is not likely to involve beating ourselves up for our flirtations with heresy or ridiculing others for theirs. The work of catechism and ecumenical interfaith dialogue is difficult, not least because of the cognitive biases that we all share, and which experimental psychologists have shed a bit of light on. Perhaps the next step is to investigate ways of overcoming these difficulties. I seem to have finished 10 minutes early, but thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, for a fascinating talk that it elucidated quite a number of things, experimental design and the psychology of religion itself. Can I encourage people to put some questions in the Q&A box? There's a couple coming in already, but do continue to add to that. Can I maybe start off in a number of points in your fascinating talk? You alluded to different studies between children and adults. Does that actually say that children are inherently more religious than adults, or inherently more gullible, or why should we expect there to be a difference between children and adults?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the reason psychologists like to study children is because by the time you're an adult, you've learned a lot of things. So in the context of religion, you'll have had lots of religious indoctrination, and also you will have learned a bunch of things at school about maths and sciences and that kind of thing. So, your way of thinking about the world will have been culturally shaped in quite a strong way by the time you're an adult. So what most developmental psychologists are interested in is to try to figure out like what's the sort of state, what's the natural state of being, right? So absent all this cultural scaffolding and education and indoctrination, whatever you call it, how do children think? What are they like? And of course, by the time they can speak, by the time they're 4 or 5, as it were, it's too late. But it is still closer to the kind of a sort of innocence than adulthood. And there are experiments there are experimenters who work on infants, pre-verbal infants, where none of this cultural scaffolding is in play yet, or at least minimal amounts of cultural scaffolding is in play. So I'll give you a brief example of this. A few colleagues of mine and I have put together a series of experiments which try to work out whether or not children have intuitions about. So these are 1-year-olds, right? So pre-verbal infants. We wanted to know whether or not they have intuitions about supernatural powers, right? Okay, so like, what does that even mean if you're a 1-year-old 1-year-old infant? Now we know that from quite a young age, certainly before they're 1, children have these sort of expectations about what is possible in the physical world. So if you throw a ball and it goes something like this in a parabola, children think, yeah, that's fine, right? That's not at all surprising. But if you threw a ball and it clung in midair and fell to the ground, children sort of like stare for longer. Their pupils dilate and they stare for a long time, as if they're surprised that a ball would cling to midair and then fall to the ground. So it seems as though children have some intuitive expectations about the physical world. So we exploited this in our study. So we showed children these cartoon blobs, and they will either cross a valley by crossing a bridge, or cross a valley by floating in the air across the bridge. So the children were habituated to two different kinds of agents that were, as it were, normal, and agents that were cartoon agents that were supernatural in this way. They violated the laws of physics as intuitively understood by even 1-year-olds. And it seems like they discriminated between these two cases, and also were less surprised when we pitted the two agents against each other in a competition, and the supernatural agent won the competition. So they found that less surprising than if the normal agent that crossed a bridge to cross a valley, when that agent won. So there are things that we can do to try and get at pre-verbal, pre-educated children as a way of getting at what human beings are like before all this cultural accretion.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a rather different sort of questions asking, can you say something about this distinction between superstition and religion? Those two terms are often used interchangeably, and maybe sometimes the emphasis more of these studies is on superstition religion. Sorry, I think my audio may be playing at the moment. Hold on, I'll come back and see if
Yeah, it's all right. I understood the question anyway, so so I can make my way into the question first. So I have a sort of idiosyncratic view about how terms are used. In that I tend to think that scientists kind of get to stipulate what we mean by certain things, and then and our field of inquiries are constrained by the way we use these words. The way my colleagues and I tend to use the term religion is specifically to refer to the belief in what you might think of as supernatural agents, right? Gods, ghosts, goblins, that kind of thing. And the way psychologists mostly use the word superstition is to see illusory causal patterns, right? In particular, illusory causal patterns that involve your own behavior. So, for example, the sort of superstitious rituals that some sports players perform before a big game, or like wearing a lucky shirt, that kind of thing. So there it seems like there's some kind of belief that there's a kind of causal relationship between this thing that I'm doing and the outcome, and this causal relationship is in fact illusory. So when that happens, we call that superstition. Now, like, how do people like out there in the world generally use the term? I they map on somewhat to the sort of more constrained technical usage, but they won't map on perfectly. And then there's a question of, okay, like, how are these things relate to one another? Well, I think it's true that some of the psychological processes involved in superstition, such as perception of illusory correlations or causal relationships, probably does apply to both superstitious beliefs and straightforwardly, like supernatural agents, religious beliefs. But these are, as it were, for distinct phenomena.
Thank you. Maybe to follow on with that question, is there then a consensus definition of what we mean by religion?
Oh God, no. I mean, but there's no consensus definition of what we mean by gene either. So there are at least 7 senses of the word gene in the biological literature, right, from the molecular to the functional and everywhere in between. There's no consensus definition of what a species is, right? So there are any number of definitions of species. There's one that's very commonly accepted, but it's got huge problems because it doesn't account for ring species. So it's never really stopped scientists from investigating a phenomenon just because there isn't one definition for the thing. In some ways, arriving at a consensus of a definition is the end of a research program rather than the beginning of a research program. All that definitions do for scientists, at least at the beginning of an investigation, is to sort of help us sort out what we're interested in studying, and then eventually we might get like the nature of the thing, and then we have this like consensus definition.
So, how do you think that definitions of religion in any way influence the different parties and the experiments in producing the empirical results?
Yeah, so this is much more obvious in the 19th century than it is now. So after David Hume in the 18th century, there's this bifurcation between English scholars and French scholars. English scholars, some people think this is because English scholars were mostly Protestants, but in any case, English scholars were sort of focused on like individuals' beliefs in whatever, right? Beliefs in gods and magic and that sort of thing. And French scholars, being, some people think it's because they were Catholics, were more focused on the sort of social aspects of things. So they didn't really care what sorts of things people believed as long as the beliefs were shared. And there was a particular focus on ritual. And so what you got was the French, like Émile Durkheim, for example, who defined religion almost in terms of the social function of the thing, and paid particular attention not to experience or to belief, but to ritual. And then on this side of the divide, we mostly paid attention to what people believed and how people felt. And in America, the same thing happened, right? There's an emphasis on religious experience, and in particular the experience of the individual. And that led people to just study different phenomena, and to have different paradigmatic cases of religion as their main example to go back to, their main source of data and example, and that sort of thing. And I think that, like, to some extent, this is an acceptable state of affairs as long as we know that the different theorists mean slightly different things when they use the term religion. As long as we're aware of that, I think the problem doesn't go away as such, but it is mitigated, because then we can do the job of putting the theories together to have a sort of more holistic sense of where religion comes from.
Thank you. Here's a different question. It's somewhat convoluted, so I will read it out as it's on the screen in front of me, so as not to misrepresent the question or to get myself tied in knots. So the questioner asks, they say that they were intrigued by your suggestion at the end of the presentation that baked into the notion of a theory of a subject's physical or psychological state is the notion that it must be a theory of some or any other subject state. And the questioner asks, I'm wondering if this points to an in-principle limit to the unintelligibility of a first personal perspective in general universal terms.
I have it in front of me too, so I get to read this. I get to read this again myself. Okay. I think it's so. The Victorians again were hugely guilty of this particular error of thinking. Well, okay, if I imagine myself during the Pleistocene, or if I imagine myself in like pre-Christian Australasia, and I were to observe the the wind and the sun and the stars and the crops failing or whatever, how would I feel? Like this is a kind of scholarship by introspection, right? So we derive our theories about other people in this way, on the basis of this kind of introspective behavior. And of course, they didn't then try to falsify their own hypotheses about this. They just sort of interpreted the data based on this introspective principle. And this is usually problematic because like there's no way of knowing whether or not the people in question really did reason about the world in exactly the same ways as Victorian anthropologists imagine that they did. So in that sense, I think in that direction we have a problem, right? And if we're going from a theory about our own minds to a theory about other people's minds, I think we very quickly hit up on a limit. Um, I think my proposal is more that we can do things the other way around, which is, having explained other people's religious beliefs, we might then turn the same kind of analysis onto ourselves to go, okay, if we think that other people's religious beliefs are caused by their upbringing or their cultural milieu or a bunch of psychological needs or cognitive biases, we might then go, okay, given that my own introspective powers are limited, like might it be the case that I'm prone to the same kinds of biases, that my own beliefs are caused by the same kinds of things as my hypotheses about other people's beliefs? And if so, what would that look like, right? Would it lead us to be more humble about the claims that we're willing to make? Would it make us more empathetic to other people's beliefs? Would it make interfaith dialogue and ecumenical dialogue that much easier, because we're not assuming that we are the reasonable ones and other people are the irrational ones? Does that answer the question? I think that was my attempt to answer that question, but I'm hoping that it did.
Thank you. It's a question about, if you like, nowadays we have more and more control over the environment, and the word purpose sometimes takes on different meanings and different levels of credibility. At what level are purposes an acceptable form of explanation these days?
Oh, it's this is an interesting move in philosophy of biology. There is a sense, and I don't know enough about the literature to know how great of a sense, but there's a sense in which Aristotle is back in the philosophy of biology, and explanations that come from causal powers attached to essences have become like a little bit more acceptable again. And so if you know anything about sort of Aristotelian notions of essence, they are teleological in nature, right? So the essence of a species gives it an account of what a good version of that thing looks like. So to that extent, it seems like purpose is sort of back in biology, and there's a sense in which it never went away, right? So language of purpose has always been around. So think about natural selection, right? So selection being a kind of quasi-intentional act. And even like Darwin's own examples began with artificial selection, obviously intentional, and then he drew analogies from there to natural selection, which he had hoped to say like it's not intentional in the same kind of way, but it seemed like people just found it really, really hard to escape talking about evolution in anything but teleological and certainly functional terms. There have been philosophers of biology who try to carve out a way of talking about function that doesn't have any sense of teleology in it. But it's not obvious that these attempts succeed. It seems like most philosophers want to be able to talk about teleology in some sense without it being the theistic sense.
Thank you. Is it the question here that the cognitive science of religion seems to suggest that religious belief is natural in a way that maybe scientific belief is not. So if religion is a basic feature of human nature, what does that say about the viability of very secularist cultures?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, like I mean, as Roger knows, who asked the question, I think we have to be very careful about religion here. So what the cognitive science of religion theorists are saying is that certain tendencies towards supernatural thinking, which actually Christians would find to be idolatrous or heretical, those are natural. Whereas theological beliefs, like theologically acceptable beliefs to Christians, are no more natural than scientific theories are. Like the doctrine of the Trinity is extremely hard to comprehend. As hard to comprehend as the idea that this table is mostly made of empty space, right? Neither of these things are intuitive. The things that are intuitive are things like, like there are gods and they look a bit like people, right? They're like God is an old dude in the sky. Those like anthropomorphic, like to me, right, to most Christian theologians, heretical views about God are those are the ones that are natural, right? So in a sense, like, so if the question is what's the viability of a very secular society, I mean, we could ask the same about what the viability of a Christian society is, given how counterintuitive Christian doctrines about God are, how in violation of our basic intuitions are. Like it seems like we should be pessimistic that anybody could, like we should be pessimistic about catechism, right? Like there's almost, it seems like there is very little hope that we'll be able to teach lots and lots of people to say the right things about God. But that's not quite fair, right? Because what we don't need is for everyone all the time to be able to respond in a way that is, like theologically pristine. We need people to know that their sort of intuitions and their instincts might be in tension with what we ought to believe, given that we belong to a particular religious tradition, right? So Buddhists know that they should believe that there is no permanent immortal soul, right? Now their intuitions might tell them otherwise, but they know that they can tutor their intuitions by reminding themselves that, well, according to my tradition, I shouldn't believe in the soul. And Christians can do the same, right? So Christians are taught to believe that God is the ground of all being, that God is not like an old dude with a beard in the sky. So despite our intuitions and unfortunately our depictions of God in stained glass and paintings, we should be able to tutor ourselves in this way. And I think the same thing can be said for scientific society, for at least secular scientific society, is that people can constantly remind themselves, for example, that there is no God. Now, there is another reason to be skeptical that there will ever be a secular society, which is that for a very straightforward reason, which is that people who are not religious don't have children as much as people who are religious. The best population models tell us that by 2050, there will be more Muslims than Christians because of the growth of the population in Africa and Asia, and also that as a proportion of the world population, there will be very, very, very few atheists. So that has nothing to do with cognitive architecture. That has just to do with reproduction rates.
Thank you. At various times you've used the word supernatural, and I wonder if you could define what you mean by that. After all, today's impossible can be seen as tomorrow's normal, and are we making, feel like, a subjective distinction there?
Great, yeah, that's such a good question. In the sort of good old days where all this work was done mostly by philosophers of religion, you had these like weird tautological claims tautological definitions of supernatural as just whatever wasn't natural, and you know, and well then what's natural? Well, it's whatever physicists tell us is natural, which just always seemed to me like a crazy way to define anything, is to rely on a bunch of physicists. So how the way that people like me, people like sort of cognitive scientists think about supernatural is to step aside from the metaphysical question altogether. Like we just have no metaphysical definition of the supernatural. What we're interested in is in like what people think of as supernatural. And so our definition is purely cognitive, right? So I said earlier that children have these expectations about the physical world, that seem for lack of a better word, that seem innate, right? So if we have these intuitive expectations about the physical world, which, as it were, are innate, then there's the possibility that some idea can violate our intuitive expectations. And so a supernatural idea is just any idea that violates our intuitive expectations about the natural world. And that's all. So we're not making a metaphysical claim here. We're just making a cognitive one. So it's like one way of thinking about this is that a supernatural idea is any idea that is, as it were, surprising in a particular way. It's surprising in the sense that it violates inferences that are, as it were, innate.
Thank you. A rather different question is that, can you say anything? Has anybody studied at all the effects of something like autism on belief in supernatural agents and God?
Yeah, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do for two reasons. One is that autistic children are very difficult to study. There are, for example, like language difficulties. And by the time they're adults, they will have absorbed a lot of cultural scaffolding. So there's a lot of studies on adults with autism show very small effects, very small differences between people with autism and people who are neurotypical. And it's very hard to know whether or not that's because we've all learned to say particular things about God, about religion, etc. There is some evidence that, and like I sort of hesitate to say this because there are very, very few studies, and the sample sizes are very small, and the effect sizes are very small. But there are very few studies that indicate that the adults with autism think about God in a slightly different way, that in a sort of less personalistic ways. I don't know how much stock to put in these findings, again, because the samples are quite small, and they're just quite hard to do. I know there's some qualitative work, which is not which is not really my thing, but like I don't have an objection to qualitative research of this kind. I do know that there's some qualitative work that comes out of, I think, Denmark, where children with autism, slightly older children with autism, are interviewed about their relationship with God, how they imagine supernatural beings and that sort of thing, which indicates that so the person who does most of this, her name is Ingela Vissuri. I can spell it somewhere if you like, Ingela Vissuri. So she's done these interviews with children with autism, and her general sense is that actually the difference between kids with autism and neurotypical kids is inflated in the literature. I don't really know what to make of this yet. Like I think it's quite early days, and there just needs to be more and better data.
Thank you very much. We've worked you very hard with questions. I'm going to draw things to a close in a moment. Here's one, I feel like, I don't know if it's a gift of a question for you or it's a difficult one. For your own perspective, in closing, what do you think be the next direction for psychological studies of religion? Where are we going now?
Yeah, I've been trying to think about this for a long time in writing this book. And okay, so a bit of background. In the 1960s and 70s, you know, like we began to see philosophers who were Christians doing philosophy of religion, right? So Richard Swinburne, Alvin Plantinga, sort of that group of people. Some of you might know. And Plantinga's great vision was not to do philosophy of religion as such, right? But was to do, philosophical theology, really, right? Was to use the philosophical tools for the service of thinking through doctrinal questions, like specifically Christian doctrinal questions. And I've always felt that that was really, it was a really admirable ambition, right? We just say, look, you know, we in the early days we do philosophy for the guild, right? The guild being other philosophers, but one day, right, we'll do philosophy for the church. Um, and I think one of the directions, I'm not suggesting that this is the only direction we should go, but I do think one of the directions that at least psychologists who are Christians should go is to try and figure out how we can serve the church like more directly, right? So it's all well and good to theologize and philosophize about the cognitive science of religion or the evolution of religion, but there's so much work that's already available, done by psychologists that are relevant to what Christians do kind of on a daily basis, in particular Christian ministers, right? So think about what we do in ministry, talking to bereaved people, talking to lonely people, preparing people for marriage. Like all these are things that psychologists have something interesting to contribute to, and to the extent that there are special questions that arise when people are religiously committed. There just isn't all that much data in that looks specifically at that kind of thing. And I think, you know, like, why shouldn't there be, right? And if it's possible to study religion as a psychologist, if it's possible to study religion experimentally, then we might think a bit more creatively about how we think about and assess the things that we do as churches, right? So we're all interested in, you know, church growth, say, and it can be numerical growth, it can be the growth as a disciple, whatever. But we're all interested in these things. We're interested in how to bring up our children so that they keep the faith or whatever. But we don't really know how to go about doing it, right? Like, you know, we don't tend to collect systematic data on what sorts of things work. And I guess I don't see why not. Like, why not kind of turn our tools to ourselves and figure out, okay, like what sorts of things work to grow a church? What sorts of things work to grow disciples? What sorts of things work in terms of parenting children in the Christian household? And if psychologists, with the tools that we have, with the skills that we have, can turn our attention not to how many publications we can rack up or how senior we can climb, you know, up the academic greasy pole, but instead of turning our skills and methods to questions that are actually pressing for the church, that I think is not a bad use of our talents and training.
Thank you ever so much for that. And thank you for the whole of your talk today. A very clear presentation. We've worked you hard in the questions. If we were here in person, there would be a tremendous round of applause. So you can take that as a virtual applause. Thank you ever so much for your talk to us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
So Jonathan, thank you again for being very clear with us this afternoon and for your talk. And thank you.
Thank you very much. See you later.